Nurses, what's the wildest thing you saw in the psych ward? There was this old man I took care of a while back. He fought in World War II and had problems with his memory. Every so often he'd think he was back in the war. It was wild to watch. This old guy would suddenly start running down the hallway like crazy. He'd grab onto you and yell, "Get down!" Hide behind the sandbags. Then he'd try to hand you his imaginary gun, saying it was too heavy, and he'd use his pretend pistol instead. After that, he'd run back down the hallway as fast as he could. It was so weird to see someone that old run so fast. But the really sad part was thinking about how awful it must be to keep reliving the scariest parts of your life over and over. This poor man had seen terrible things in the war, and his mind kept bringing him back there. I felt so bad for him, stuck in those awful memories and not knowing what was real anymore. Story 2. I got a job working in a hospital for kids with mental health problems. It seemed like an easy job at first. I could wear normal clothes, and mostly I just had to give out medicine and watch the kids. One day, I was sitting next to this 15-year-old boy. He was black and a bit heavy. We were just talking about his day. Everything was normal. Then, out of nowhere, he jumped up and started screaming super loud. He was moving his body all crazy, like he was having some kind of fit. It looked worse than any seizure I'd ever seen. I had no idea what to do. How could I help him? How could I make it stop? I was freaking out inside, getting more and more scared as it went on. It felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably just a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The boy sat back down next to me and started talking normally again, like nothing had happened. He said it was just one of his spells. Let me tell you, being that close to someone going crazy like that is really scary. It shakes you up in a way that's hard to explain. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I hope I never do again. Story 3. A nurse I know told me a really upsetting story about something that happened where she worked. It was in a place for people who might hurt themselves, and they had special rules to keep everyone safe. There was this one patient who needed extra care. He was so worried about hurting himself that a staff member had to stay right next to him all the time. They call this a suicide watch. The idea is that if someone's always there, they can stop the person from doing anything dangerous. But one day, something terrible happened. The patient and the staff member were standing close to each other, like they were supposed to. Then, all of a sudden, the patient did something no one expected. He ran as fast as he could, straight at the wall. He smashed his head into it really hard. It was so awful that the patient broke his neck when he hit the wall. He died right there, even with someone watching him. The nurse who told me this story was really shaken up by it. It showed how sometimes, even when people try their hardest to keep others safe, scary and sad things can still happen. Story 4. When I was learning to be a nurse, I had to work for a while in a mental hospital run by nuns. The place was really old and kind of scary. I could tell you about the people getting shock therapy in the basement, but that's another story. Today I want to talk about Maggie. Maggie was an older lady who had been sick for a long time. She used to take medicine that helped her think clearly, but it started to make her really sick, so she had to stop taking it. One hot summer day, we heard Maggie screaming super loud from her room. We ran to see what was wrong. When we got there, I saw something I'll never forget. Maggie, who was almost 80 years old, was standing on the window ledge without any clothes on. She was yelling through the window screen at the nuns in the yard outside. She was calling them mean names and saying they would go to hell. The poor nuns were running around, trying to get away from Maggie's angry yelling. We were trying really hard to pull Maggie off the window, but she wouldn't budge. It was so crazy and scary. After seeing all that, I knew for sure I didn't want to be a nurse in a mental hospital when I grew up. It was just too intense for me. Story 5. I once saw something really disturbing at the hospital. There was this guy who thought he had rats inside his body. He said his old girlfriend used magic to put them there. The man was so sure about this that he tried to get the rats out himself. But there weren't any rats. It was all in his mind because he was very sick. He ended up hurting himself really badly in a sensitive area of his body. It was awful to watch. This poor man was so confused that he caused himself terrible pain. His mind was telling him something that wasn't true, but to him it felt completely real. Story 6. My family has had some tough times with mental health. Both of my sisters have been in hospitals for people with mental problems. They saw some pretty wild stuff there. When my first sister was getting help for not eating enough, she told me about a girl who tried to choke someone using a bra. Can you imagine? It must have been really scary to see that happen. Then last year, my other sister was in the hospital because she was feeling so sad she thought about hurting herself. While she was there, she saw a kid get so angry that he ripped a water fountain right off the wall. Another kid kept screaming for his shoes over and over. But the story that really stuck with me was about this one boy. His mom told him they were going on a fun trip. Instead, she took him to the hospital and left him there. When he figured out what happened, he yelled at one of the workers, "That mean lady lied to me." He must have felt so tricked and upset. Story 7. I once met this guy who played the trumpet. He also worked at a place that helps people who have trouble remembering things. He told me a really interesting story about one of the people living there. This person used to be a professional musician when he was younger. Now he loved playing the piano, but he could only remember one song. It was called Darktown Strutter's Ball. The problem was, he wanted to play this song all the time, over and over again. The people working at the home tried everything to get him to stop. They locked the piano, but he would break it open. They hid the piano, but he always found it. It was driving everyone a little crazy. One day, the trumpet player I met was there when the old musician was looking for the piano. The old man was getting really upset because he couldn't find it. Then the trumpet player had a clever idea. He said to the old musician, "What are you doing? It's break time. You shouldn't play during your break. Why don't you go to the bar and get a drink instead?" And you know what? It worked. The old musician understood that and stopped looking for the piano. He wasn't upset anymore. Story 8. My sister has been working as a nurse in a mental hospital for about 10 years. She's seen and been through a lot of tough stuff there. She's told me many stories about her experiences, and some of them are pretty shocking. Almost every day, someone tries to hurt her physically. People have threatened to do all sorts of scary things to her. It's a dangerous job, and she has to be really brave. The patients sometimes do gross things too. They've thrown different kinds of body fluids around, smeared them on things, and even tried to eat or drink them. It's hard to imagine dealing with that all the time. My sister used to like her job, but after all these years, it's gotten really hard for her. She doesn't enjoy it anymore. It's just too stressful and upsetting. That's why she decided to go back to school. She just finished getting a degree to become a teacher instead. She hopes this new job will be less dangerous and more enjoyable. Story 9. I'm not a nurse, but I work as a pharmacist. We deal with all kinds of patients, including some who have serious mental health problems. Sometimes we hear about really shocking things that happen. We had this one patient who was supposed to come in for a monthly meeting about her medicine. When she didn't show up, we started calling around to find out where she was. We found out she was in the hospital's emergency room. The reason was pretty disturbing. She had eaten 2 of her own fingers. After doing that, she just went to visit her mom for coffee, even though she was still bleeding. It's hard to imagine how confused and unwell she must have been to do something like that. A friend told me about another patient with a different but equally upsetting problem. This person had made a cut in their leg and kept opening it up over and over. Eventually, the whole area turned into a big pocket of scar tissue. Surprisingly, it didn't get infected for a long time. The patient started using this pocket in their leg to hide things. They'd put pens, coins, and other stuff they found in the hospital in there. Nobody knew about it for a while. But then a paperclip poked through the skin, and the pocket finally got infected. The patient had to go to the emergency room, and that's when the doctors found all the stuff hidden in their leg. Story 10. I work at a hospital for people with mental health problems. I'm not a nurse yet, but I'm going to start nursing school soon. My job can be really tough and sometimes scary. We had this really big, tall patient who got angry when we asked him not to stand naked in the doorway. He tried to hit a nurse and another worker, so we had to take him to a special room to calm down. In that room, he did a bunch of really gross and dangerous things. He tried to hurt himself with his underwear, so we had to take it away. Then he peed on the floor and started doing push-ups in it. He even tried to drink it, which is super unhealthy. After that, he wrote on the walls with his pee and did some other really inappropriate things. He also said some very scary things to me. We gave him some medicine to help him calm down. When we thought he was better, we opened the door. But then he bit my hand so hard it started bleeding. After that, I asked if I could stop working with him, and someone else took over. This kind of thing happens a lot where I work. I get hurt by patients almost every week. It's not even a place for the sickest patients, but it's still really dangerous. I'm looking forward to changing my job when I start nursing school. The pay isn't very good for such hard and scary work. I only make about $15 an hour, which doesn't seem fair for dealing with all this tough stuff. Story 11. When I was learning to be a nurse, I had to work for a day at a mental hospital. My job was to watch one girl and see how she acted. At first, it seemed pretty normal. She just ate a bunch of pudding cups, like 6 of them in half an hour. But then something really weird happened. The girl finished her pudding, licked her spoon clean, and then did something shocking. She pulled up her sleeve and pushed the whole spoon into a cut on her arm. She was so calm about it, she just said, "Oops," like it was no big deal. When I told the nurses what happened, they didn't believe me. They thought I was making it up. I guess it seemed too strange to be true. Hours later, someone noticed the girl had blood on her shirt. They took her to change clothes and saw that the cut on her arm was open and bleeding. Finally, they sent her to the hospital to get checked out. The doctors took an X-ray, and guess what? The whole spoon was inside her arm. It turns out she had a small cut there from having a birth control thing taken out the week before. She had been picking at the stitches to make the cut bigger. The really weird part? The girl said her "oops" wasn't because she put a spoon in her arm. It was because the spoon got stuck and she couldn't pull it out. Story 12. I'm a nurse at a mental hospital in Boston, and I've seen some pretty wild things. But there's one story I'll never forget. We had this patient who was really hyper and kept getting into fights. He'd been moved to our area because other patients were trying to attack him. This all happened when I was working the night shift. Around 3 in the morning, this guy came up to me saying his tooth hurt really bad. He wanted to see a dentist right away. I told him we didn't have a dentist there, but the doctor could look at it in the morning. I gave him some pain medicine and told him to go back to bed. About 5 minutes later, he came back. He was saying his tooth hurt so much, he needed it pulled out. I started to explain again that we didn't have a dentist, but maybe I could get him some stronger medicine. Then, right in the middle of me talking, he did something shocking. He stuck his hand in his mouth and pulled out his own tooth. It was a big back tooth, a molar. He just handed it to me like it was no big deal. Blood started pouring out of his mouth, but he didn't even seem to notice. I had to clean him up and stop the bleeding. I called the doctor to get him some medicine to calm him down. After all that, you know what he said? He told me, "Make sure you give me that tooth back when I leave. That's my tooth, don't try and steal it." He was really serious about it. Story 13. I used to work as a security guard at a hospital. Even though I wasn't a nurse, I still saw some pretty shocking things. There's one patient I remember that really stands out. This person had a problem with hurting themselves on purpose. One day, they did something really extreme and dangerous. They cut a hole in their own skin, right around their belly button. But that wasn't all. After making this hole, they started putting small objects inside it. They pushed things like paper clips and buttons into the wound. It's hard to imagine how painful and dangerous that must have been. This kind of behavior is called self-harm. It's something that some people with serious mental health problems might do. They might hurt themselves because they're feeling really upset or confused, or because they don't know how else to deal with their emotions. Seeing something like this shows how important it is to get help for people with mental health problems. It's not just about keeping them safe from others, but also about protecting them from hurting themselves. Story 14. I used to work at a place that helps people quit drugs. One day, we had this really interesting situation that I'll never forget. There was a man there trying to quit using meth, which is a really strong and dangerous drug. When people stop using drugs like that, they can feel really sick and upset for a while. We call this detox. This man was having a really hard time. He was so upset that he was hitting the desk with his fists and yelling. He kept shouting, "I just want some fucking ice." Now, ice is a slang word that drug users sometimes use for meth. I was trying to calm him down by talking to him, but the other worker who was with me didn't know much about drug slang. She thought the man literally wanted some frozen water. So while I was talking to the man, she went to the kitchen and got him a glass of ice cubes. She brought it out and gave it to him like she'd solved all his problems. The man and I both realized what had happened at the same time. He was asking for drugs, but she gave him actual ice. We looked at each other and just started laughing. It was amazing to see how quickly the man went from being so angry to laughing. He still had some tough days ahead of him, but for a moment, this funny mistake made things a little better. Story 15. I used to work in a hospital where we sometimes had patients with mental health problems. There was this one patient who wasn't exactly crazy, but he was always really confused and grumpy. One night, I was getting his drink ready. I had to add some stuff to make it thicker so he could swallow it easily. Like always, he started yelling at me, saying I was trying to poison him. I tried to explain what I was doing, and that we were all there to help him, not hurt him. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me I'm just gonna die. Now this guy was always saying negative things, so I didn't think too much about it. He seemed okay. He was awake, his heart rate and breathing were normal, and there weren't any obvious signs that something was wrong. But about an hour later, something terrible happened. The patient's heart suddenly stopped beating. We call this a code blue in the hospital. It means there's an emergency, and we need to try to save someone's life right away. We tried really hard to save him, but we couldn't. He died. Story 16. Working in a mental hospital can be really strange sometimes. Here are a few stories about some of the patients I've seen. There was this really old lady who would come out of her room at night without a shirt on. She'd hold out her droopy breasts and say in a funny accent, my nipples, please, for the children." We never knew what she meant by that. Another patient, a woman in her 40s, kept stealing the shower mat from the bathroom. She'd put it under her bed because she thought she was God. She believed we were trying to hurt her by shocking her private parts at night, and the mat would stop it. Of course, none of that was true. It was all in her mind. One of the most interesting patients was a woman with really bad schizophrenia. She'd say the weirdest things. She told me my name was the worst fairy tale lie that she ever wrote in the 2 Bibles for her daddy. When she got mad at me, she'd yell, "Get out of here, fairy tale book. I wish I never wrote you." This same woman did some other strange things too. Once, when some nursing students were trying to make ghost decorations for Halloween using tissues and lollipops, she got really upset. She tried to hit them, yelling, "You idiots, you can't make ghosts out of lollipops." Another time, when different nursing students brought in pizzas for a party, she walked up and down the tables looking at the food. Then out of nowhere, she started throwing the pizza around and yelling, "What's this supposed to be? Some kind of pizza test?" Story 17. I work as a counselor in a mental health hospital. When I was just starting out, I met a teenage girl who was having a really tough time. She was very depressed and kept thinking about hurting herself. This girl told me something that shocked me so much. I didn't know what to say at first. Usually I can respond pretty quickly when patients tell me things, even if it's just to say, "Wow." But this time was different. She told me that the year before, on Thanksgiving Day, something terrible happened. Her whole family was sitting around the dinner table when her dad suddenly pulled out a gun. Then right in front of everyone, he shot himself. When she told me this, I got really quiet. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. I had to take a moment to think about what I'd just heard. It was such a sad and shocking story that I needed time to figure out how to respond. Story 18. I wasn't working at a mental hospital, but I was a patient there once. During my stay, I saw something really scary happen. There was this really big guy watching a football game on TV. Another patient changed the channel, and this made the big guy super angry. He got so mad that he started hitting the other patient in the head with his fists. The attack was really bad. The patient who got hit didn't die, but he was hurt pretty badly. They had to take him away to get help. A few days later, they brought the hurt patient back to the mental hospital. But then something even scarier happened. He started having a seizure. That's when your body shakes all over and you can't control it. It was probably because of how badly he'd been hit in the head. They had to take the hurt patient away again after that. I never saw him come back to the mental hospital after that. Story 19. My sister had to stay in a mental hospital earlier this year because she was having problems with eating. She was put in a part of the hospital that was right next to a special area called the PICU. That stands for Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit, which is where they keep people who need extra help and watching. One night, my sister heard a lot of screaming coming from the PICU. Later, she found out what had happened, and it was pretty shocking. One of the patients in the PICU had gotten really out of control. When the nurses were trying to calm them down, this patient actually bit a big piece of skin off a nurse's leg. But it didn't stop there. The patient then started to eat the piece of skin they had bitten off. It's hard to believe that things like this can really happen. It shows how some mental health problems can make people do really extreme and dangerous things. Story 20. My dad used to work in two really tough places in Australia back in the 1970s. One was called Aridal, which was a hospital for people with serious mental health problems. The other was J Ward, a special prison for people who had committed crimes because of their mental illnesses. In J Ward, on nice sunny days, they'd let the patients go outside. But some of the patients would do inappropriate things in public that I can't describe in detail. Let's just say they had trouble controlling themselves. At Aridale, they tried to stop this behavior by putting special mittens on the patient's hands. But some patients would chew holes in the mittens just so they could keep doing these inappropriate things. Dad's worst story was about a woman at Aridal who was very, very sick in her mind. She had hurt herself badly, leaving scars all over her face from scratching. She even tried to bite herself all over her body. The scariest thing was that she would chew the inside of her mouth until it bled, then try to spit the blood at the workers' faces. She hoped they would catch the diseases she had. These stories show how challenging it can be to work with people who have really serious mental health problems. Some of these people did things that were gross, scary, or dangerous because their minds weren't working right. It's important to remember that mental health care has gotten a lot better since the 1970s. Today, we have better ways to help people with mental illnesses, and places like Aridale and J Ward don't exist anymore. We try to treat people with mental health problems with more kindness and understanding now. Story 21. I was once a patient in a mental hospital. It wasn't because I was really sick, but I needed some help. The hospital had two parts, one for people who needed a lot of help, and one for people like me who didn't need as much. One night, something really scary happened. A really tall, strong man from the other part of the hospital got out of his room. He wasn't supposed to be able to do that. He came all the way to my room. I woke up and saw him standing in my doorway. He looked pretty scared himself. In a shaky voice, he asked me if I was okay. I was really nervous, but I said yes. When I said that, the man's face changed. He looked terrified, like he'd seen a ghost. He yelled, "I knew it! You can see them too. Don't let them get you." I didn't know what he was talking about. There wasn't anything there to see, but in his mind there must have been something really scary. Right after that, some security guards came and took the man away. He was screaming as they dragged him back to his part of the hospital. 22. I once went to a prison to see if I wanted to work there as a warden. While I was there, I visited a special part of the prison where they keep a close eye on some inmates to keep them safe. In this area, I heard about a prisoner who had done something really extreme and dangerous to himself. He had used a razor to cut open his own stomach. Then he started pulling pieces of himself out, like it was some kind of game. But that's not all. The cut on his stomach wouldn't heal properly, so it turned into a kind of hole. The prisoner started using this hole as a hiding place. One time they found a towel stuffed inside it. His body had even started growing around the towel, which is really dangerous. The strange thing was, they told me this prisoner was actually quite nice to talk to. It's hard to understand how someone who seems nice could do such terrible things to themselves. After seeing and hearing about all this, I decided that working in a prison wasn't the right job for me. I didn't even apply for the job in the end. Story 23. I was talking to a guy in a mental hospital once. He was really upset because they wouldn't let him have something called whiteout. It's like liquid paper that people used to use to fix mistakes when typing. The man was on what's called suicide watch. That means the doctors were worried he might try to hurt himself, so they were being extra careful. The man thought it was stupid that they wouldn't let him have whiteout. He said, if I really wanted to hurt myself, I could use the string from the blinds, or stab myself with a pencil, or use a metal bar from the typewriter. At first, I kind of agreed with him. It did seem silly to keep such a small thing away from him when there were other things around that could be dangerous. But when I told my teacher about our conversation, she pointed out something really important. She said the fact that the man could think of so many ways to hurt himself so quickly showed that he had been thinking about it a lot. That's exactly why he needed to be watched so carefully. I realized then that the doctors were right to be so careful, even about small things like whiteout. When someone is having thoughts about hurting themselves, it's important to remove anything that might tempt them or make it easier. Story 24. My mom had a really interesting job when she was young. She worked in a mental hospital in Ireland back in the early 1960s. She was only about 15 years old at the time. Even though it was a tough job and some patients would try to hurt her, my mom actually enjoyed working there. But there was one patient who really stood out in her memory. Every single day, this patient would tell my mom that he was going to kill her when she finished work. Now that sounds really scary, but my mom figured out a clever way to handle it. She knew this patient really loved music, so every time he threatened her, she would tell him, "Oh, I can't die today. I'm going out dancing tonight. Could you wait until tomorrow?" And he would always agree. The funny thing was, the next day, the patient would forget all about what he said before. He'd make the same threat again, and my mom would use the same excuse. This went on for a couple of years while she worked there. Story 25. When I was studying psychology in school, I had to visit a mental hospital for a few days. I was there to learn how to talk to patients. Even though I was only there for a short time, I saw some things that really stuck with me. There were two patients that I can't forget. The first was an old man who was in a state called catatonic. This means he was so still and unresponsive that he looked like he wasn't even alive. It was scary to think that if something had happened to him, it might have taken a long time for anyone to notice. The other patient was a lady who thought she could see worms on her skin. Of course, there weren't really any worms there, but in her mind, they were real. She kept trying to pick them off. It was really sad to watch her struggle with something that wasn't actually there. I knew that some of the patients in the hospital could be dangerous sometimes. That's why the doors were always locked. But it wasn't the possibility of violence that upset me the most. It was seeing these two people suffering in their own minds that really got to me. This experience taught me how serious mental health problems can be. It's not just about feeling sad or worried sometimes. For some people, mental illness can completely change how they see the world, or even stop them from being able to move or respond. That's why it's so important to take mental health seriously. We need to understand these illnesses better and find ways to help people who are dealing with them. Nobody should have to live the way those patients were living. Story 26. When I was younger, I had to stay in a mental health hospital for kids for 30 days. There were two other kids there that I still remember clearly. One was a boy named David. He was only 13, but he was really tall for his age. David liked to watch scary movies, and everyone was too afraid to tell him no, because he could be violent sometimes. He also talked a lot about wanting to hurt people, which was scary. David hated taking his medicine. About 2 or 3 times every week, he would fight with the nurses who tried to give it to him. It was shocking to see that it took 5 or 6 grown-up men to stop him from fighting. He was a really strong kid. The other person I remember was a girl named Wendy. She was also 13 and was actually very nice, but she always wore the same clothes and smelled really bad. I learned that some kids who have been hurt by their family members on purpose do this. They think that if they smell bad, people won't want to hurt them anymore. It was a really sad situation. Even though Wendy smelled bad, I gave her a big hug every night before we had to go to our rooms. I wanted her to know that someone cared about her. This experience showed me how mental health problems can affect kids in really different ways. Some, like David, might act out and be scary. Others, like Wendy, might hurt in quiet ways that are hard to see. It made me realize how important it is to be kind to everyone, because you never know what they're going through. Story 27. When I was in the mental hospital, it felt like I was in a movie. There were two other patients I remember clearly. Jess, a girl my age, and Richard, a man about 10 years older than me. Jess wasn't very encouraging when I first got there. She told me, yeah, they said I'd only be here for a few days too, but it's been 3 months now. She advised me to be nice to the nurses so they might let me out early. It made me feel like I was in some kind of scary story. Richard was friendlier. He loved talking about something called quantum physics, saying it would change our future. I don't think he really understood it, though. Once, when I was bored and made some origami figures, Richard got all excited. He started telling me how I should sell my origami creations. There were other things that made the place feel strange. The coffee was always lukewarm. We weren't allowed to have butter knives. When we took showers, there was always a staff member waiting outside the door. The thing that bothered me most was how many calming medicines they gave me. I was just a teenager who was feeling really sad, but they gave me so many sedatives. It seemed like too much. Story 28. I've been working in a mental hospital for about 2 years now. Let me tell you, some pretty wild things happen there. Sometimes it feels like the staff are just as crazy as the patients. Here are some of the craziest things I've seen. One time, a patient managed to climb up into the ceiling. We couldn't figure out how to get them down for a long time. It was like a game of hide and seek, but way more serious. Another weird thing I learned is that some of the medicines we give patients can make them produce milk, even if they're not pregnant or nursing a baby. One patient actually squeezed their own milk into their coffee. It was pretty gross. Once, all the teenage patients in our unit escaped. Can you believe it? The maintenance people forgot to lock the gate. We were really worried, but luckily all the kids came back on their own after a while. As for me, I once got hurt trying to stop a patient from escaping. I hit my head and got a concussion. That's when your brain gets shaken up and it can make you feel really dizzy and sick. I had to stay home from work for 6 weeks to recover. At least the patient didn't manage to escape. Story 29. At the hospital where I was staying, there was a lady who had a sickness called dementia. This illness makes it hard for people to remember things, especially as they get older. This lady's husband, Bob, had just died, and she was having a really tough time. The saddest part was that because of her dementia, she couldn't remember that Bob had passed away. Every day, many times a day, she would suddenly say, "I need to call Bob. He doesn't know where I am." When this happened, the nurses would gently ask her where she thought Bob was, but she couldn't remember. Then they would have to tell her the sad news that Bob had died. Every single time, it was like she was hearing it for the first time. She would get really upset and start crying. The nurses would then take her back to her room to rest. This happened about 10 times every day. It was really hard to watch. Imagine finding out that someone you love has died, and then forgetting it, only to learn about it all over again. It was like she had to go through the sadness of losing her husband over and over. Story 30. I used to work as a social worker in a special hospital. One part of the hospital was for people who would probably never be able to leave because of their mental health problems. We called them lifers. In my part of the hospital, there were 14 beds, and they were all full. One of the patients was a really big guy named Simon. He was super tall and heavy. Simon had a mental illness called schizophrenia, which he got from using drugs. He also had bipolar disorder, which makes people's moods change a lot. Simon always talked to himself, but never to anyone else. All the other patients were scared of him because he was so big. One day, I came to work early to do some paperwork. When I tried to open the door, I heard Simon hitting it with his fists. I looked through the little window in the door and saw that Simon and the whole hallway were covered in blood. I got really scared and called for help because I thought Simon might have hurt someone. But that's not what happened at all. It turned out that Simon was having what we call a manic episode. This is when someone with bipolar disorder gets super energetic and can't control themselves. Simon had been walking back and forth all night long. He walked so much that the skin on the bottom of his feet actually came off. And because of some other medicine he was taking, he bled a lot more than usual. We looked at the security cameras to see what happened. Simon had been walking and talking to himself all night long. The person who was supposed to be watching the patients had fallen asleep during his whole shift and didn't hear Simon at all. That person got fired that day for not doing his job. Story 31. I once saw a patient who had done something really shocking to himself. He had what looked like a tattoo on his neck, but it wasn't a normal tattoo at all. This man had used a pen to carve a design into his own skin. He did it by holding the pen in his fist and pushing it into his skin over and over again. If you've ever seen a little kid coloring really hard with a crayon, gripping it in their whole fist, that's kind of how he must have done it. The tattoo was on the left side of his neck, just below his ear. It didn't look smooth like a regular tattoo. Instead, it was all scratchy looking. Even though they said he'd done it a long time ago, it was still red and looked painful. Story 32. I was staying in a mental health hospital, and one night something really weird happened. I was sleeping when suddenly I felt someone grab my toe. I woke up right away and said, "What's going on?" I saw it was a girl, and she ran away as soon as I woke up. I was pretty upset about this, so I went to the front desk to tell them what happened. But while I was talking to the lady at the desk, something even crazier happened. The same girl who had grabbed my toe suddenly jumped on my back. She was holding on tight and screaming, kind of like a monkey. It was such a strange thing to happen. I was so surprised that I just threw her off me. The really weird part was how the lady at the desk reacted. She just said, "Sorry about that," like it was no big deal. Story 33. I work as an emergency medical worker and also volunteered for a little while in a mental health hospital. My experience was pretty short, but it taught me something really interesting. The thing that surprised me the most wasn't seeing people act crazy. Instead, it was seeing how many patients seemed totally normal. Story 33. I've taken lots of people to mental health hospitals in my ambulance. These people have all kinds of different mental illnesses. But when I talk to them, many of them seem completely fine. They might just seem a little worried or nervous, but otherwise, they act just like anyone else. A lot of times I'd look at these patients and think, why are they even here? They seem totally normal to me. This experience taught me something really important. Mental health problems aren't always easy to see from the outside. Someone might look and act normal most of the time, but still be struggling with serious problems in their mind. Story 34. I spent some time in a special part of a children's hospital for kids with mental health problems. It was a pretty strange experience. Our rooms were near the nurse's desk and had special glass so they could always see us. Even the bathrooms didn't have locks. There were a few of us teens there. Another girl and I were there because we weren't eating enough. One guy was there because he wanted to hurt himself badly. He couldn't have normal things like forks or blankets because of this. There was also a homeless kid who'd been hit by a car. His leg was in a cast, but he kept sneaking around in his wheelchair and taking extra stuff from all over the hospital. We all became friends in a weird way. We'd play cards together and talk about the strangest things. Like I'd offer food I was supposed to eat but didn't want to. The homeless kid would trade things he'd taken from other places. The other girl who didn't eat enough would try to find ways to cheat when they weighed her. And the guy who wanted to hurt himself would ask really scary questions about ways he could do that. Looking back, it was a really odd time in my life. We were all dealing with serious problems, but we found ways to connect with each other. Some of the things we did weren't good for us, like trying to avoid eating or thinking about self-harm, but having friends who understood what we were going through was helpful in its own way. Story 35. In the mental hospital where I was, some really amazing and some really wild things happened. Let me tell you about them. The most amazing thing was when we found out there was a piano in the hospital. There was this patient who never talked to anyone. One day, she just sat down at the piano and started playing. She knew so many songs by heart. It was incredible. Everyone in the hospital, patients and staff, came to listen. For about half an hour, nobody said a word. We all just sat there, listening to the beautiful music. But there were some pretty crazy things that happened too. Once, a patient's family members got really angry and tried to hurt him because his sister had done something inappropriate with another patient. It was really scary. Another time, there was this guy who thought he was Jesus. He managed to convince everyone to meet on the balcony to talk about how to break out of the hospital. Can you imagine? There was also this one patient who would run away every single day. He'd steal a car and then drive it right back to the hospital. It was like he couldn't decide if he wanted to leave or stay. Sometimes things got really weird. Some patients would start talking in strange ways that nobody could understand. That was pretty scary to see. Story 36. I spent about 3 years in mental health hospitals when I was a teenager and in my early 20s. During that time, I saw a lot of things, but one memory really stands out as the funniest. There was this kid who had to stay in a special room by himself because he was causing trouble. But instead of calming down, he decided to have some fun by making things hard for the staff. He took apart the plastic mattress in his room and tore all the foam inside into tiny pieces. Then he put the empty mattress cover on like it was a costume. He started running around yelling, "I'm Gumby! Damn it!" Gumby is an old cartoon character who's shaped kind of like a mattress. While he was doing this, he threw all the little pieces of foam around like it was confetti at a party. It was such a silly sight that almost everyone, even most of the staff members, couldn't help but laugh. Story 37. At the hospital where I worked, we once had a patient who was really challenging to care for. He was only 16 years old, but he was very big and strong, about 6 feet 2 inches tall and 220 pounds. He was built like a football player. This teenager had some serious problems. He had been at a special school for kids with autism, but he hurt one of the teachers really badly. That's why they sent him to our hospital. The biggest problem was that this young man could be very violent. He was stronger than most people and would often start fights for no reason. It always took 4 to 6 staff members to stop him when he got violent. Because he was so hard to handle, he spent a lot of time in what we called the safety room. This was a very small room with soft walls and nothing else in it. It was meant to keep him and others safe when he was feeling violent. The really sad part was that he ended up staying with us for 1.5 years. His parents wouldn't let us move him somewhere else that might have been better for him, but they also wouldn't take him home. Our hospital wasn't really set up to help someone with such serious behavior problems for such a long time. Story 38. When I worked at a mental health hospital, I saw many people who were thinking about hurting themselves. But there was one patient I'll never forget because he seemed to have completely given up on life. This man was over 60 years old. He had been homeless most of his life and had been in and out of hospitals many times. Sometimes he lived with his brother's family, but it became too hard for them to take care of him. I had to watch this man all the time because he would try to hurt himself with anything he could find. Even though I'm not a doctor or a therapist, I spent hours listening to him talk. The things he said were so sad and hopeless. He didn't believe anything could ever get better. The doctors gave him lots of medicine to try to help him feel better, but it didn't seem to work. Then, after a certain number of days, they said he could leave the hospital. I was really surprised by this. I didn't think he was ready to be on his own. The next day, there was a new patient in his room. I never found out what happened to the man or why they let him go. It really bothered me because I was worried about him and didn't understand why he was sent away when he seemed so unwell. Story 39. Sometimes at the mental health hospital where I worked, we'd get patients who had been there before and knew how things worked. Some of these people didn't want to take their medicine. They knew that in jail, they couldn't be forced to take medicine, so they would act really violent to get sent to jail instead of staying in the hospital. One day, I was doing paperwork when I heard a call for help. I ran out of the office towards where the patients hang out, but one patient was waiting for me around a corner. He had picked up one of our light plastic chairs and was ready to use it like a baseball bat. As I came around the corner, he swung the chair at me. I tried to block it with my arms, but he pushed really hard. Even though I weigh about 150 pounds, he was able to throw me backwards about 15 feet down the hallway. I was lucky and only got a small bruise on my arm and my bottom. But the patient got what he wanted. He was sent to jail, where he wouldn't have to take medicine. Story 40. I used to work in a mental health hospital where patients could go outside in shared courtyards. One day, a patient who hadn't showered in a while came to sit with us. He believed in some pretty strange ideas about the government watching him. I tried to help by telling him, "Hey, you know where the government can't see you?" In the shower. Surprisingly, it worked. He went to take a shower, but about 10 minutes later, something crazy happened. This same guy came running out of his building into the courtyard. He was completely naked and still covered in soap. 2 other workers were chasing him. I felt responsible since I'd suggested the shower, so I joined in trying to catch him. We chased him around the courtyard a few times before we got him back to his room. Once in his room, he jumped on his bed. He tried to trick us by pretending to go one way, then jumping the other way onto his roommate's bed. The other 2 workers tried to grab him, but he was so slippery from the soap that it was hard to hold onto him. They all ended up falling onto the bed together. One of the workers slipped on the wet floor and accidentally fell face first into the patient's butt cheeks. Story 41. When I was 19, I had to stay in a mental health hospital for the first time. I was already feeling nervous and couldn't sleep well the first night. At first, I thought it was okay that my roommate was quiet. The next day, I spent some time talking to other patients in the common room. But when I went back to my room, I saw something scary. My roommate had written, "Find them," all over the walls and was talking to herself. I was really frightened and called a nurse for help. The nurse tried to talk to my roommate but couldn't understand her. I asked to sleep somewhere else that night. They let me stay in a special room by myself. The next morning I woke up to hear a fight in the hallway. I found out later that one patient had done something inappropriate in front of another patient and got punched for it. Later that week, the same patient who caused the fight cornered me and asked me to do something inappropriate with him in the bathroom. This really scared me and made me cry. My whole first time in the hospital was really frightening. Story 42. During my time in a mental health hospital, I saw some pretty intense things. Once, a woman I shared a room with really wanted to leave. Her ex-husband came to sign her out, and when they gave him her medicine, he let her pack it herself. Sadly, she tried to drink most of the pills. The nurses found her just in time and had to call an ambulance. I still wonder if she's okay now. There was also this guy who thought he was better than everyone else. He said some really mean things about people who were very sad and had tried to hurt themselves. He kept telling everyone he was the boss of a big company, which wasn't true. After a while, no one wanted to talk to him anymore because he was so unkind. When I was learning to be a nurse, I met a patient who sometimes got very confused. One day, he made a huge mess in his room when he was really out of it. While I was trying to help him clean up and change clothes, a bunch of medical students came in. The confused man started trying to kiss me, which was super embarrassing. The students just laughed instead of helping. The funny part was, the next day when this man wasn't confused anymore, he apologized to me. He said, "I'm not nuts. I'm a fruitcake, really." I thought to myself that he might be both, but I didn't say it out loud. Story 43. There was this older man at the mental hospital where I worked who really stood out. He looked and dressed like he was from an old movie, kind of like Frank Sinatra or one of those guys from the 1950s. He had been living in the hospital for a long time and was usually pretty calm when he took his medicine. The interesting thing about this man was the way he talked. He couldn't control his words very well, so he would just say whatever came into his mind. It was like listening to someone's thoughts out loud all day long. For example, if he wanted a cup of coffee, he might say something like, "I used to work down at the mill, and my landlady, Grace, she loved coffee, or I would be in trouble with my uncle." It took some time to figure out what he really meant when he talked like this. Even though it was sometimes hard to understand him, he was actually a really nice man. He could be sweet and friendly most of the time. Sometimes he would yell, but that didn't happen too often. I kind of miss having him around. He was one of those patients who really sticks in your memory.